We're going to be doing a nice little experiment today. No craziness. A lot of the sound alerts are turned off. We're going to be having a nice, chill storytelling stream today. Thank you so much to everybody who gave me this idea and has been hyping me up. Let's have a nice, pleasant couple of hours. Okay? You've all been working very hard, and I'm very proud of you. You deserve a break. That's what we're here for. A nice break from everything. Are you guys ready? Let's go to the garage. Aw, Yomi. You know just what to say to make me smile. Hello, Sane. How are you doing? Let's give a shout out to Sane as well. I want everyone to feel nice and comfortable, whether it's my loyal customers or fellow friends. We're going to be using this lighting today because I feel like it's a little bit more soothing. My dog just walked in the room. Always the most inopportune times. And hopefully we won't have any audio issues, so I'm not blowing my mic out all the time. This will help a lot while I work on thumbnails and stuff for the week. In fact, planning August, we will talk. Yes, I do need to give you my availability for August, Yomi. I'm very excited to finally collabing with you. What feels like months in the making. Whatever we end up deciding to do, I know I'll have a good time. My favorite scientist. Insane, I hope you are having a good day as well. Aww. Mwah. Love you, Yomi. Welcome back, Lore. I know you didn't want to miss this at all. I just want to say before we start, thank you all so much for giving me the confidence to try something like this. I'm looking forward to it. Vtubing has definitely made me feel a lot more comfortable with my voice, the way I present myself. So these ASMR streams will be a great way to both give back to you guys, show how far I've come, and also a little bit of voice acting practice as well. Today, we will be reading Volume 1, or as much of Volume 1 as I can get through, of the hit series Spice and Wolf, which is one of my favorite anime of all time, with some of my favorite characters of all time, Bolo the Wise Wolf. But I've never actually read the light novels that they are based on. So today we will be doing that. Yes, Lore, everyone has had a very long, chaotic day. I personally had a very long, chaotic week filled with tech issues. But we have a lot of the redeems turned off. I have a lot of sounds turned off. You guys can still redeem, hydrate, and stuff like that, but there just won't be any on-screen stuff going on. Because the whole point is for this to be a nice, smooth, consistent experience. Oh shoot, I forgot. Yes, you could still put sticky notes on my head. In fact, I should probably get more sticky notes for this. But now that we have all of that out of the way, are we ready to begin? I think we're ready to begin. This is for you guys. Enjoy. So without further ado, Spice and Wolf Volume 1, the Prologue. In this village, when the ripened ears of wheat sway in the breeze, it is said that a wolf runs through them. This is because one can make out the form of a running wolf in the shifting stalks of the wheat fields. When the wind is too strong and the stalks are blown over, it is said that the wolf has trampled them. When the harvest is poor, it is said that the wolf has eaten it. It was a nice turn of phrase, but it had a troublesome aspect that flawed it, she felt. Still, lately it was a popular sort of expression, and there were few remaining who wielded it with the sort of familiarity or awe that it held in the past. Although the summer sky that was visible between the swaying stalks of wheat had not changed in hundreds of years, conditions below that sky had indeed changed. The villagers who tended the wheat as the years passed lived for 70 years at the most. Perhaps it would be worse for them to go centuries without changing. Maybe that is why there is no need for them to honor the ancient agreement, she thought. In any case, she knew she no longer had a place here. The mountains that rose in the east caused the clouds over the village to drift mostly north. She thought of her homeland beyond those drifting clouds and sighed, returning her gaze from the sky to the fields. Her eyes fell upon her magnificent tail, which twitched just past her nose. With nothing better to do, she set to grooming it. The autumn sky was high and clear. Harvest time had come. Many wolves were running through the wheat fields. And that concludes the prologue. Chapter 1. So that's the last then. Looks like 70 pelts on the nose. Always a pleasure. Hey, anytime. You're the only one who'll come this far into the mountains, Lawrence. I should be thanking you. But for my trouble, I get truly fine pelts. I'll come again. The usual pleasantries concluded. Kraft Lawrence managed to leave the village just around 5 o'clock. The sun was just beginning its climb when he left, and it was midday by the time he descended from the mountains and entered the plains. The weather was good. There was no wind. It was a perfect day for dozing in the wagon as he crossed the plains. It seemed absurd that only recently he had felt the chill of the approaching winter. This was Lawrence's 7th year as a traveling merchant and his 25th since birth. He gave a huge yawn in the driver's box. There were few grasses or trees of any noticeable height, so he had an expansive view. At the very edge of his field of vision, he could see a monastery that had been built some years earlier. He could see a monastery that had been built some years earlier. He didn't know what young noble was cloistered in this remote location. The masonry of the building was magnificent. And unbelievably, it even had an iron gate. Lawrence seemed to remember that roughly 20 monks lived there, attended to by a similar number of manservants. When the monastery had first been built, Lawrence had anticipated fresh clientele. The monks were somehow able to secure supplies without employing independent merchants, though, so his dreams were fleeting. Admittedly, the monks lived simply. tilling their fields, so trade with them would not be especially profitable. There was another problem in that they would probably solicit donations and leave their bills unpaid. As far as simple trade went, they were worse partners than out. They were worse partners than out-and-out thieves. Still, there were times when trade with them was convenient. Thus, Lawrence looked in the direction of the monastery with some small regret, but then his eyes narrowed. From the direction of the monastery, someone was waving at him. What's this? The figure did not look like a manservant. They wore dark brown work clothes. The waving figure was covered in gray clothing. His deliberate approach likely meant some hassle, but ignoring him could make matters worse later. Lawrence reluctantly turned his horse towards the figure. Perhaps having realized that Lawrence was now headed his way, the figure stopped waving, but made no move to approach. He appeared to be waiting for the cart's arrival. It would hardly be the first time that a church-associated person demonstrated arrogance. Lawrence was in no mood to take ever such insult personally. As he approached the monastery and the figure became clearer, Lawrence muttered in spite of himself, "A knight." At first dismissed the idea as ridiculous, but as he drew nearer, he saw that it was unmistakably a knight. The gray clothing was in fact silver armor. "You there, what is your business here?" The distance between them was still too far for conversation, which is why the knight yelled. He apparently felt no need to introduce himself, as if his position were obvious. "I am Lawrence, a traveling merchant. Do you require my service?" The monastery was now directly in front of him. He was close enough to count the number of servants working in the fields to the south. He also noted the knight in front of him was not alone. There was another one past the monastery, perhaps standing guard. "A merchant? There's no town in the direction you come from, merchant," said the knight haughtily, sticking out his chest as if to display the golden cross that was engraved there. But the mantle draped over his shoulders was gray, indicating a knight of low rank. His blonde hair looked freshly cut, and his body did not look as if it had been through many battles. So his pride mostly came from being a new knight. It was important to deal with such men carefully. They tend to be excitable. So instead of replying, Lawrence took a leather pouch out of his breast pocket and slowly undid the twine that held it closed. Inside were candies made of crystallized honey. He plucked one out and popped it into his mouth, then offered the open bag to the knight. "Would you care for one?" Said the knight, hesitating momentarily before his desire for the sweet candy won out. Still, perhaps because of his position as a knight, a considerable amount of time passed between his initial nod and when he actually reached out and took the honey drop. "Half a day's travel east of here, there's a small village in the mountains. I was trading salt there." I see you have a load in your cart. Salt as well?" "No, but furs. Look," said Lawrence, turning around and removing the tarp that covered his load, revealing a bundle of magnificent marted pelts. A year's salary of the knight before him was paltry compared to its worth. And this?" This wheat I received from the village." The sheaf of wheat in the corner of the mountain of furs that had been harvested in the village where Lawrence had traded his salt. It was hardly in cold weather and resisted insects. He had planned to sell it in the northwest, where crops had sustained heavy frost damage. Very well, you pass." It was a strange way of speaking to someone who'd summoned him over so highly earlier. But if Lawrence were to meekly say, "Yes, sir," Now, a fine merchant he'd be. Why, thank you, questionable bard, for the 5 biddies. I appreciate your services and contributions to the garage. Now, where were we? So, what occasions have you I'm sorry. So, what occasions your post here tonight, good sir? The knight's brow knitted in constraint at the question and furrowed still deeper as he glanced at the bag of honey drops. Lumios, thank you so much for the gifted sub. Much appreciated, and your contributions to the garage are always welcome. I greatly appreciate you. Mwah. He was well and truly caught now. Lawrence undid the bag's string closure and tucked out another sweet, giving it to the knight. Delicious, I should thank you. The knight was being reasonable. Lawrence inclined his head gratefully, using his best trader's smile. The monks have caught wind of a big pagan festival that's approaching, thus the increased guard. Do you know anything of this festival? If his face had betrayed any hint of disappointment at the explanation, calling it a third-rate performance would have been generous, so Lawrence only affected a pained expression and answered, Sadly, I know nothing. This was, of course, a huge lie, but the knight was just as mistaken, so there was nothing for it. Perhaps it truly is being held in secret, then. Pagans are a cowardly lot, after all. The knight was so mistaken it was amusing, but Lawrence merely agreed and took his leave. The knight nodded and thanked him again for the honey drops. Undoubtedly they had been delicious. Most of the knight's money went to the equipment and lodging. Even an apprentice cobbler lived a better life. It had surely been a long time since the knight had eaten anything sweet. Not that Lawrence had any intention of giving him another piece. Still, a pagan's festival, they say. Lawrence repeated the knight's words to himself once the monastery was well behind him. Lawrence had an inkling of what the knight was talking about, actually. Anyone from this area would know about it. But it was no pagan festival. For one thing, true pagans were farther north, or farther east. The festival that happened here was hardly something one needed knights to guard against. It was a simple harvest festival, of the sort to be found nearly anywhere. True, this area's festival was somewhat grander than the typical celebration, which is probably why the monastery was keeping an eye on it and reporting to the city. The church had long been unable to keep control over the area, which undoubtedly made it all the more nervous about going-ons. Indeed, the church had been eager to hold inquisitions and convert heathens. The clashes between natural philosophers and theologians in the city were far from rare. The time when the church could command the populace's unconditional submission was vanishing. Topical, wouldn't you say? The dignity of the institution was beginning to crumble, even if the inhabitants of the cities said nothing. All were grandly beginning to realize it. In fact, the Pope had recently had to petition the monarchs of several nations for funds when tithens had come in below expectations. Such a tale had been preposterous even 10 years before. Thus, the church was desperate to regain its authority. Business everywhere will suffer, said Lawrence with a rueful smile, popping another honey drop into his mouth. The western skies were a more beautiful golden hue than the wheat in the field by the time Lawrence arrived in the plains. Distant birds became tiny shadows as they hurried home, and here and there the frogs sang themselves to sleep. It appeared that the wheat fields had been mostly harvested, so the festival will undoubtedly begin soon. Perhaps even as soon as the day after tomorrow. Before Lawrence lay the expanses of the village of Polysis, fertile wheat fields. The more abundant the harvest, the more prosperous the villagers. Furthermore, the noble who managed to land, the one Count Eldrot, was a famous area eccentric who enjoyed working in the fields himself. Naturally, the festival also enjoyed his support, and every year it was a riot of wine and song. Lawrence had not once participated in it, though. Unfortunately, outsiders were not permitted. "Whoa there, good work," Lawrence called out to a farmer driving a cart heaped high with wheat in the corner of one of the fields. It was well-ripened wheat. Those who had invested in those wheat furs. Pardon me. Those who had invested in those wheat futures could breathe a sigh of relief. "What's that?" "Might you tell me where you find Yarrow?" Lawrence asked. "Oh, Yarrow'll be over yonder. See where the crowd is gathering? That field, it's all youngsters at their place this year. Whoever's slowest will wind up being with Holo," said the farmer good-naturedly, his tan face smiling. It was a kind of gulliness smile a merchant could never manage. Lawrence thanked the farmer with his best trader's smile and turned his horse toward Yarrow's place. Lust, as the farmers had said. There was a crowd. Oh, I'm sorry, this was a mistranslation. Just as the farmer had said, there was a crowd gathering within its confines, and they were shouting something. They seemed to be making sport of the few who were still working the fields. But it wasn't ridicule at their lateness. The jeering was part of the festival. As Lawrence lazily approached the crowd, he was able to make out their shouting. "There, a wolf! A wolf! A wolf lies there! Who will be the last to catch the wolf? Who? The villagers shouted, their faces so cheerful one wondered if they were drunk. None of them noticed Lawrence pulling his cart up behind the crowd. What they so enthusiastically called a wolf was in fact not a wolf at all. Had it been real, no one would have been laughing. The wolf was the harvest god, and according to village legend, it resided within the last stalk of wheat to be reaped. Whoever cut that stalk down would be possessed by the wolf, it was said. "It's the last bundle. Mind you, don't cut too far. Holo flees from the greedy hand. Who will catch the wolf? It's Yarrel, 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 Yarrel." Lawrence got off his wagon and peered at the crowd just as Yarrel caught the last bundle of wheat. His face was black with sweat and soil as he grinned and heaved the wheat high, throwing his head back and howled, "Ow! It's Holo, it's Holo, it's Holo! Ow! Holo the wolf is here! Holo the wolf is here! Catch it now! Catch it quick! Don't let it escape!" The shouting men suddenly gave chase after Yarrel, the god of the bountiful harvest. Once cornered, would possess a human and try to escape, capture it, and it would remain for another year. None knew if this god truly existed, but this was an old tradition in the area. Lawrence had traveled far and wide, so he put no stock in the teachings of the church, but his faith in superstition was greater ever than of the farmers here. Too many times had he crossed mountains only to arrive in towns and find the price of his goods dropping preposterously. It was enough to make anyone suspicious. Thus he didn't bat an eye at traditions that true believers or church officials would have found outrageous. But it was inconvenient that Yorl was this year's Holo. Now Yorl would be locked in a granary stocked with treats until the festival was over, close to a week, and it would be impossible to talk to him. Nothing for it, I suppose, said Lawrence, sighing as he returned to his wagon and made for the village's head residence. He had wanted to enjoy some drinks with Jarl and report on the events of the monastery, but if he didn't sell the furs that were piled high in his wagon bed, he wouldn't be able to pay for goods purchased elsewhere when the bills came due. He also wanted to sell the wheat he had bought from the other village and couldn't wait around for the festival to end. Lawrence talked briefly at the midday happenings of the monastery to the village's head, who was busy with festival preparations. He politely declined the offer to stay the night and put the village behind him. Years before the Count to manage... Sorry, something stuck in my throat. Years before the Count began to manage the region, it had suffered under heavy taxes that drove up the prices of its exports. Lawrence had bought some of this unfavorably high-priced wheat and sold it for but a meager profit. He hadn't done it to win favor with the village, but rather because he simply didn't have the resources to compete with other merchants for the cheaper, finer grain. Nevertheless, the village was still grateful for his business then, and Jarl has been the middleman for the deal. It was unfortunate that he couldn't enjoy a drink with Jarl. But once Holo appeared, Lawrence could soon be chased out of the village as the festival came to its climax. If he had stayed the night, he wouldn't have been able to stay long. As he sat on his wagon, Lawrence felt a sense of loneliness at being excluded thus. Nibbling at some vegetables he had been given as a souvenir, he took the road west, passing cheerful farmers returning from their day's work. Having returned to his lonely travel, Lawrence envied the farmers with his friends. Lawrence was a traveling merchant and a 25-year-old. At 12, he had apprenticed under a relative, and at 18, he had set out on his own. There were many places he had yet to visit, and he felt that the true test of his mettle as a trader has yet to come. Like any number of traveling merchants, his dream was to save enough money to open a shop in a town, but the dream still deemed itself distant. If he could seize himself upon a good opportunity, it might not be so, but unfortunately the larger traders seize such opportunities with their money. Nevertheless, he hauled loads of goods across the countryside in order to pay his debts in a timely fashion. Even if he saw a good opportunity, he lacked the wherewithal to seize it. To a traveling merchant, so that such a thing was as unreachable as the moon in the sky. Lawrence looked up at the moon and sighed. He realized such sighs were more frequent lately, whether as a reaction to years of frantic trading simply to make ends meet, or because recently he'd gotten slightly ahead and was thinking more about the future. Additionally, when he should have been thinking about little else besides creditors, payment declines, and getting to the next town as quickly as possible, thoughts chased one another through his head. Specifically, he thought of the people he had met in his travels. He thought of the merchants he had come to know when visiting a town repeatedly on business, and the villagers he had become acquainted with at his destinations. The maidservant had fallen for during a long stay at an inn, waiting for a blizzard to pass, and on and on. In short, he longed for company more and more frequently. Such longing was an occupational hazard for merchants who spent the better part of a year alone in a wagon. But Lawrence had only recently begun to feel it. Until now, he'd always boasted that it would never happen to him. Still, having spent so many days alone with a horse, he started to feel that it would be nice if the horse could speak. Stories of cart horses becoming human were not uncommon among traveling merchants, and Lawrence had since the beginning laughed off such yarns as ridiculous. But lately, he wondered if they could be true. When a young merchant went to buy a horse from a horse trader, some would even recommend a mare with a completely straight face. You know, just in case she turns human on you. This had happened to Lawrence, who'd ignored the advice and bought a sturdy stallion. The same horse was working steadily in front of him even now, but as time passed and Lawrence grew lonely, He wondered if he might have been better off with a mare after all. On the other hand, that horse hauled heavy loads day in and day out. Even if it were to become a human, it seemed impossible that it would fall in love with its master or use its mysterious powers to bring them good fortune. It would probably want to be paid and have rest, Lawrence mused. As soon as this occurred to him, he felt that it was best if a horse stayed a horse. Even if it did make him selfish, Lawrence smiled bitterly and sighed as it Lawrence smiled bitterly and sighed, as if tired of himself. Yes, the musings of a horse turning human. Definitely worth the lewd sticker, Lumios. I see you. You all are so silly. Whoops. There we go, one of the stickers got stuck. Let us continue. How are you guys enjoying my tale of the traveling merchant Craft Lawrence? Do any of you ever feel listless when traveling? Those moments when you feel so lonely, you'd think, if only my pet were human or could talk back to me. Maybe that would stave off the loneliness that encroaches upon those days when we indulge in all work and no play. I too feel that sometimes as a VTuber prepping for the hard days and streams ahead. I'm glad you guys feel soothed. If there's anything I can do to make things more enjoyable, please don't hesitate to let me know. Much like how Lawrence is a merchant who tries to make sure that the customer is satisfied, as do I. Now then, shall we continue? Presently he came to a river and decided to make camp for the night. The full moon was bright, but that did not guarantee that he wouldn't fall into the river. As if that happened, calling it a disaster would be an understatement. He'd have to hang himself. That kind of trouble he did not need. Lawrence pulled back on the reins and the horse stopped at the signal, heaving 2 or 3 sighs as it realized its long-anticipated rest was here. Here, let me get nice and cozy with you guys as well. There we go. Nice and cozy. Yes. Giving the rest of his vegetables to the horse, Lawrence took a bucket out of a wagon bed and drew some water from the river, setting it before the animal. As it happily slurped at the bucket, Lawrence drank some of the water he had gotten from the village. Wine would have been nicer, but drinking without a partner only made the loneliness worse. There was no guarantee he wouldn't get staggering drunk either, so Lawrence decided to go to bed. He had half-heartedly nibbled on vegetables most of the way, so he had only a bite of beef before hopping back in the wagon bed. Normally he'd sleep in the hemp tarp that covered the bed, but tonight he had a wagon load of martened pelts, so it would be a waste not to sleep in them. They might make him smell a bit beastly in the morning, but it was better than freezing. But jumping right into the pelts would crush the weed shelf, so in order to move them aside, he whisked the tarp off the wagon bed. The only reason he didn't shout was because the sight that greeted him was flatly unbelievable. Apparently, Craft Lawrence, the traveling merchant, had a guest. Hey! Lawrence wasn't sure his voice actually made a sound. He was shocked and wondered if the loneliness had finally broken him and he was hallucinating. But after he shook his head and rubbed his eyes, his guest had not disappeared. The beautiful girl was sleeping so soundly it seemed like a shame to wake her. Hey, you there, said Lawrence nonetheless. Spice and Wolf mentioned indeed, Saint, you came at a most opportune time. He meant to inquire what exactly would motivate someone to sleep in a wagon bed. In the worst case, it might be a village runaway. He didn't want that kind of trouble. Came the girl's defenseless response to Lawrence, her eyes still closed, her voice so sweet that it would make a poor traveling merchant, accustomed only to the brothels of the city, lightheaded. She had a terrifying allure despite her obvious youth, nestled there in the firs and illuminated by the moonlight. Lawrence gulped before returning to reason. Given that she was so beautiful, if she was a prostitute, there was no telling how much he would be taken for if he was so much to so much as touch her. Considering the economics of the situation, was a tonic tar more effective than any prayer? Lawrence regained his composure and raised his voice once again. Hey, you there! What are you playing at, sleeping in someone else's cart? The girl did not awaken. Fed up with this girl who slept so obscenely, Lawrence grabbed the pelt that supported her head and jerked it out from under her. The girl's head flopped into the gap left by the pelt, and finally he heard her irritated squawk. He was about to raise his voice again at her, but then he froze. The girl had dog ears on her head. Now the girl seemed to be fully awake. Lawrence summoned his courage and spoke again. You there! What are you doing, climbing in my wagon bed? Lawrence had been robbed more than once by thieves and bandits as he crossed the countryside. He considered himself bolder and more courageous than the average person. He wasn't one to quill just because the girl in front of him happened to have the ears of an animal. Despite the fact that the girl hadn't answered his question, Lawrence did not pose them again. This was because the girl, slowly awakening before him and entirely naked, was unmistakably beautiful. Her hair, illuminated by the moonlight in the wagon, looked as soft as silk and fell over her shoulder like the finest cloak. The strands that fell down her neck to her collarbone drew a line so beautiful it put the finest paintings of the Virgin Mary to shame. Her supple arms were fine, they seemed carved from ice. And exposed now in the middle of her body were two small breasts, so beautiful they gave the impression of being carved from some inorganic material. They gave off a strangely vital scent, as if housed within her arrested charm and warmth. But such a fascinating spectacle could just as soon go away. The girl slowly opened her mouth. Looking skyward, closing her eyes, she howled, "Ow!" Lawrence felt a sudden fear. It blew through his body like a wind. The howl was the song of a wolf. In fact, it was the song that it would use to summon its comrades to chase and corner a human. This was no howl like Yarrell had uttered earlier. It was a true howl. Lawrence dropped the bite of beef from his mouth. His horse reeled, startled. Then he realized something. The moonlit girl's form, with the ears on her head, the ears of a beast. "'Tis a good moon. Have you no wine?" she said, letting the howl fade away, drawing her chin up and smiling slightly. Lawrence came back to himself at the sound of her voice. What was before him was neither dog nor wolf. It was a beautiful girl with the ears of an animal. "I have none. And what are you? Why do you sleep in my cart? Were you to be sold in town? Did you escape?" Lawrence meant to ask as authoritatively as he could, but the girl did not so much as move. "What? Have you no wine?" food then. Such a waste, said the girl unconcernedly, her nose twitching. She spied the bit of beef Lawrence had almost eaten earlier, stepped it up, and popped it into her mouth. As she chewed, Lawrence did not fail to note the two sharp tangs behind the girl's lips. I believe the translation meant fangs. Are you some kind of demon? He asked, his hand falling to the dagger at his waist. As traveling merchants often needed to convert large amounts of currency, they often carried their money in the form of items. The silver dagger was one such item. The silver was known as a holy metal, strong against evil. However, Lawrence put his hand to the dagger and posed his question. The girl looked blankly at him, and then laughed heartfully. Me, a demon. Her mouth drew open wide enough to drop the piece of meat. The girl was so adorable as to be disarming. Her sharp fangs only added to her charm. However, being laughed at made Lawrence angry. How is that so amusing? Ah, it's amusing, it is. That is surely the first time I've been called a demon. Still giggling to herself, the girl picked up the meat again and chewed it. She did have fangs, add in her ears, and it was clear enough that she was no mere human. What are you? Me? Who but you could I be talking to? The horse, maybe. I like that. That's a good bit of clever writing, bringing the whole section full circle. I like that. Believe it or not, everybody, this is my first time reading this much of a light novel. When Lawrence drew his dagger, the girl's smile disappeared. Her red-tinted amber eyes narrowed. What are you, I say? Drawing a blade on me now. How lacking in manners. What? Ah, I see. My escape was successful. My apologies, I had forgotten, said the girl with a smile, a complete guileless and charming smile. The smile didn't particularly sway him, but nevertheless, Lawrence somehow felt that pointing a blade at a girl was an unseemly thing for a man to do. So he put it away. I am called Holo the Wise Wolf. It has been some time since I have taken this form, but, well, it is quite nice. As the girl looked herself over approvingly, Lawrence was so caught off guard by the girl and what she had said that he had missed the second half. Holo? Holo. A good name, is it not? Lawrence had traveled far and wide over many lands, but this was only one place he had heard that name. None other than the harvest god of the village of Palstrow. What a coincidence. I also know of one that goes by Holo. It was bold of her to use the name of a god, but at least this told him that she was indeed a girl from the village. Perhaps she had been hidden, raised in secret by her family, because her ears and fangs. That would fit her claim to have escaped successfully. Lawrence had heard talk of abnormal children like this being born. They were called demon children, and it was thought that a devil or spirit had possessed them at birth. If the church discovered them, they, along with their families, would be burned at the stake for demon worshipping. Such children thus either abandoned in the mountains or raised in secret. But this was the first time Lawrence had ever actually seen such a child. He had always assumed they would be disgustingly bestial, but judging from appearances, this one was a plausible goddess. Oh, I have never met another Holo. When From whence do they hail? As the girl chewed the meat, it was hard to see her trying to deceive anybody. It seemed plausible that, having been raised in confinement for so long, she really did believe herself to be a god. It is the name of this area's harvest god. Are you a god? At this, the girl's moonlit face was slightly troubled for a moment before she smiled. I have long been bound to this place and called it god, but I am nothing so great as a deity. I am merely Holo. Lawrence guessed that this meant she'd been locked away in her home since she had been born. He felt a certain sympathy for the girl. By long, do you mean that you were born here? Oh no. This was an unexpected answer. No, I was born far to the north. The north? Indeed, the summers there are short and the winters long. A world of silver. Holo's eyes narrowed as she seemed to gaze into the distance, and it seemed hard to imagine that she was lying. Her behavior, as she reminisced about the lands of the north, that was too natural to be an act. Have you ever been there? Lawrence wondered if she was counteracting, but if Holo was lying or merely repeating things she had heard from others, he would have been able to tell immediately. His travels as a merchant had in fact led him to the far north before. I've been as far as Orishastock. The year-round blowing snow is terrifying. Haven't heard of it, replied Holo, inclining her head slightly. He'd expected her to pretend to have knowledge. This was strange. What places do you know? Welcome to the Grand Tour indeed, Dropout. A place called Yotsu. Lawrence forced himself to say, don't know it, to quell the unease that rose within him. He did know of a place called Yotsu, from an old story he'd heard at an inn in the north. Were you born there? I was. How is Yotsu doing these days? Is everyone well? Holo asked, slumping slightly. It was such a fleeting gesture that it couldn't be an act. Yet Lawrence could not possibly believe her. After all, according to the story, the town of Yotsu had been destroyed by Usain monsters 600 years ago. Do you remember any other places? It's been so many centuries. Nyohira. There was a town called Nyohira. It was a strange town with hot springs. I would often go there to bathe. There were still hot springs in the north at Nyohira, where royalty and noble often visited. But how many people in this area would even know of its existence? Ignoring Lawrence's confused reverie, Holo spoke as if she were now relaxing in the hot spring. Then suddenly she sneezed. I do not mind taking human form, but it is unavoidably cold. Not enough fur, said Holo, laughing and hiding again in the pile of merchant pelts. Lawrence couldn't help laughing at her appearance. There was something that still worried him, though, so he spoke to Holo as she snuggled into the fur pile. You said something about changing forms earlier. What was that about? At this question, Holo poked her head out of the pile. And if you could all give me 1 moment to refill my water, we can resume reading. I will be back merely in 1 minute. Enjoy the nice noise and background music. And while I go get water, I would also love to know what you guys think so far an hour into our story time. I hope I'm putting on a good enough show for you all. Thank you, Laura. I didn't realize my mic was muted. Why do you guys support such a silly bean like myself? I honestly don't know how you guys put up with it. But much appreciated. Shall we resume our read-through? Where were we? You said something about changing forms earlier. What was that about? At his request, Holo poked her head out of the pile. I meant what I said. I haven't taken human form in quite some time. Charming, no? She said with a smile. Lawrence couldn't help agreeing, but he kept a straight face as he replied. The girl can make him lose his composure, that was certain. Aside from a few extra details, you're a human. Or what else? Are you a dog? Turned human, like the stories of those horses turning humans? Holo stood up at the slight provocation, turning her back to him. She looked over her shoulder at him and responded steadily. You can doubtless tell from my ears and tail that I am a proud wolf. My fellow wolves, the animals of the forest, and the people of the village all acknowledge me. It is of the white tip of my tail that I am the proudest. My ears anticipate every misfortune and hear every lie. And I have saved many friends from many dangers. When one speaks of the wise wolf of Yotsu, they speak of none other than me. Holo sniffed proudly, but soon remembered the cold and dove back into the pelts under the furs. The tail at the base of her back was indeed moving. Not just ears, then. She had a tail as well. Lawrence thought back on her howl. It was a true wolf's howl, unmistakably. Was this then truly Holo, the wolf god of the harvest? No, it can't be, muttered Lawrence to himself as he reconsidered Holo. She seemed unconcerned about him as she narrowed her eyes in the warm furs. Seen thus, she was rather cat-like, although that was not the issue at hand. Was Holo human or wasn't she? That was the question. People who were actually possessed by demons didn't fear the church because their appearance was different. Rather, they feared it because the demon within them could have caused these outward calamities, for which the church made it widely known the penalty was death at the stake. But if Holo was instead a transformed animal like in the old tales, she might bring good fortune or even be able to perform miracles. Indeed, it was the Holo, the god of the harvest. A wheat trader could ask for no other finer of a companion. Lawrence turned his attention back to Holo. Holo, was it? Yes. You said you were a wolf. I did. But all you have are a wolf's ears and tail. If you are truly a transformed wolf, you should be able to take a wolf's form. Holo stared absently for a while at Lawrence's words before something seemed to occur to her. Oh, you're telling me to show you my wolf form. Lawrence nodded at the truth of the statement, but was in fact mildly surprised. He had expected her to either be flustered or to just flatly lie. But she had done neither, instead looking simply irritated. This expression of irritation was far more persuasive than the clumsy lie or inassurance that he expected. I don't want to. Why not? Well, why do you want me to? She shot back poutly. Lawrence winced at her retort, but the question of whether Holo was human or not was an important one to him. Recovering from his stumble, Lawrence put as much confidence as he could muster into his voice, trying to regain the conversational initiative. If you were a person, one, that would I would consider turning you over to the church. Demons could cause calamity after all. But, 2, if you are really Holo, the god of harvest, in human form, then I needn't turn you in. Were she genuine, well, tales of transformed animals acting as envoys of good fortune still remained. Far from turning her in as a demon, he would happily offer her wine and bread. If not, the situation would be different. As Lawrence spoke, Holo wrinkled her nose, and her expression grew darker and darker. From what I've heard, transformed animals can change to their original forms. If you're telling the truth, you should be able to do that as well, yes? Holo listened with the same irritated expression. At length she sighed softly and slowly extracted herself from the pile of fur. I have suffered many times at the hand of the church. I'll not be given over to them. Yet... She sighed again, stroking her tail as she continued. No animal can change its form without a token. Given you humans need makeup before you can change your appearance. Likewise, I require food. What kind of food? Only a bit of wheat? That seemed more or less reasonable for a god of the harvest, Lawrence had to admit, but her next statement brought him up short. That, or fresh blood. Fresh blood? Only a little bit, though. Her casual tone made Lawrence feel that she couldn't be lying. His breath caught, and he glanced at her mouth. Just a moment ago, he'd seen those fangs behind those lips bite into the meat he had dropped. What? Are you afraid? Said Holo at Lawrence, trepidation as she smiled ruefully. Lawrence would have said, of course not, but Holo was clearly anticipating his reaction. But soon the smile disappeared from her face, and she looked away from him. If you are, then I'm even more disinclined to. Why then? Lawrence asked, putting more strength into his tone, feeling that he was being made sport of. Because you will surely quake in fear. All, be they human or animal, look on my form and give way with awe, and treat me as special. I have tired of this treatment. Are you saying I would be terrified of your true form? If you would pretend to be strong, you might first hide your trembling hand, Holo said exasperately. Lawrence looked down at his hand, but by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. You're an honest sort, said the amused Holo, but before Lawrence could offer an excuse, her expression darkened again, and she continued, quick as an arrow. Lawrence, quick as an arrow. However, just because you're honest does not mean I should show you my form. Was it you said before the truth? Before? That if I truly am a wolf, you would not give me over to the church? Lawrence had heard that there were some demons capable of illusions, so this was not a decision he could make lightly. Holo seemed to anticipate this and spoke again. Well, I have a good eye for both men and beasts. You are a man, but keeps his word, I can tell. Lawrence was still unable to find his tongue at the mischievous Holo's words. He certainly could go back on his word. He was understanding more and more that she was toying with him, but there was nothing he could do about it. I'll show you a bit then. A full transformation is difficult. You'll forgive me if I only do one arm, said Holo, reaching down into the corner of the wagon bend. For a moment, Lawrence thought that it was some sort of special pose she had to assume, but he soon realized what she was doing. Okay, we'll see you in a bit, Lumios. She was picking a grain of wheat from the stall in the corner of the wagon. What are you doing with that? Lawrence asked without thinking. Before he could even finish the question, Holo popped the grain of wheat in her mouth and closed her eyes, swallowing it like a pill. The shell of the unhusked kernel was not edible. Lawrence frowned at the thought of the bitter taste in his mouth, but that thought soon vanished at the sight that came next. Holo groaned, clutching her left arm and falling into a pile of furs. Lawrence was soon about to say something. This could not be an act. Then a strange sound reached his ears. It was like the sound of mice running through the forest. It continued for a couple of moments, then ended with a muffled thud, like something treading on soft ground. Lawrence was so surprised, he could do nothing. The next moment, Holo's formerly slim arm had transformed into the forepaw of some huge beast and was totally unsuited to the rest of her body. It really doesn't look good. The limb appeared to be so large that she should have trouble supporting it. She rested the giant leg on the pile of furs and shifted herself to accommodate it. Well, do you believe me now? She looked up at Lawrence. Lawrence was unable to reply, rubbing his eyes and shaking his head as he looked and looked again at the sight before him. The leg was magnificent and coated in dark brown fur. Given the size of the leg, the fur animal would be huge, roughly as big as a house. The paw ended in huge, scythe-like claws. And all that grew from the girl's slender shoulder. It would be strange to think it wasn't an illusion. Unable to believe it, Lawrence finally took a skin of water and doused his face with it. Aren't you doubtful of me? If you still think it's an illusion, go ahead and touch it, teased Holo, smiling, curling the giant paw in a come-hither motion. Lawrence found himself irritated, yet still hesitated. Besides the sheer size of the limb, it also gave off a certain ineffable sense of danger. It was the leg of a wolf. I've dealt with goods called dragon legs, Lawrence told himself, irritated at his cowardice, and just before his hand could touch it. Oh, Holo seemed to remember something. Lawrence snapped his hand back. What is it? Oh, nothing. Don't be so surprised, Holo said, now sounding a bit annoyed. Adding embarrassment to his fear, Lawrence became angrier and angrier, as what he felt was his failure as a man. Getting told of himself, he reached out once again. So what happened? Holo said meekly, looking up at Lawrence. Be gentle, will you? Lawrence couldn't help stopping his hand short of her suddenly endearing manner. He looked at her and she looked back at him, grinning. You are rather charming, aren't you? Lawrence said nothing as he made sure of what his hand was feeling. He was irritated at her first teasing manner, but there was another reason he failed to reply. It was of course because of what he was touching. Hello, Bobo. I see you on YouTube. He swallowed. Are you really a god? He murmured. I'm no god, as you can tell from my forepaw. I am merely bigger than my comrades. Bigger and cleverer. I am Holo, the wise wolf. The girl who so confidently called herself wise looked at Lawrence proudly. She was every bit a mischievous young girl for the aura the beast limb exuded had not something a mere animal could ever manage. It had nothing to do with the size of the thing. So, what do you think? Lawrence nodded vaguely at her words. Well, the real Holo should be in Yares now. The wolf resides in the one who cuts the last wheat stalk, they say. I am Holo the wise wolf. I know well my own limitations. It is true that I live within the wheat. Without it, I cannot live. And it is also true that during this harvest, I was within the last wheat to be harvested, and usually I cannot escape from there. Not while any were watching. However, there was an exception. Lawrence listened to her explanation, impressed with her rapid delivery. If there is merely a larger sheaf of wheat than the last one to be harvested, I can move unseen to that wheat. That's why they say it, the villagers. If you cut too greedily, you won't catch the harvest god and it will escape. Lawrence glanced at his wagon bed with a sudden realization. There was a sheaf of wheat in his cart, the wheat he had received from the mountain village. So that is how it was done. I suppose one could call you my savior. If you hadn't been there, I would have never escaped. Although Lawrence could not quite bring himself to believe those words, they were lent persuasion. When Holo swallowed a few more wheat grains and returned her arm to normal. However, Holo had said savior with a certain distaste, so Lawrence declined to get any further to her, to get any closer to her. Oh, bad. Thank you for the big stretch, Redeem before. I feel myself fading a little bit of exhaustion. I did not know that reading so much. Reading for an hour straight would take so much out of me. I can certainly see why. I'm glad that it's cozy. I'm lulling myself to sleep a little bit. I can certainly see why a lot of people opt to do sound effects and the like for their ASMR streams. Perhaps I should opt out for something similar. But I will do my best for those that are here. I would at least like to finish this section of the book. Let's see if we could go 2 hours. What do you all say? Not 2 more hours. Let us do our best. Remember, this is a test, everybody. And I'm hoping that I'm passing for all of you. He concocted the pretense on the spot, but the more he thought about it, the truer it seemed. If this Holo was the real Holo, then wouldn't the village begin suffering poor harvest? After a few moments, his ruminations ended. Holo was looking at him as if stricken. You're jesting, surely. Her sudden frail mien rocked the defenseless merchant. Hard to say, Lawrence said vaguely, trying to conceal his internal conflict and buy some time. Even as his head filled with other concerns, his heart grew only more uneasy. Lawrence agonized. If Holo was what she claimed to be, the god of harvest, his best course of action would be to return it to the village. He had long associated with Pascal. He did not wish them any ill. However, when he looked back at Holo, her earlier bravado was entirely gone. Now she looked down, as apprehensive as any princess in an old knight tale. Lawrence grimaced and put the question to himself. Should I return this girl to the village, even though she clearly does not want to go? What if she is the real Holo? He mulled the matter over in a cold sweat, the two questions battling in his mind. Presently, he became aware of someone looking at him. He followed the look to his wit source and saw Holo gazing at him beseechingly. Please, help me, won't you? Unable to stand the sight of Holo so meekly bowing her head, Lawrence turned away. All he saw, day in and day out, was the backside of a horse. The girl left him completely unable to resist a girl like Holo looking at him with such a face. Agonizingly, he came to a decision. He turned slowly back towards Holo and asked her a single question. I must ask you one thing. All right? If you leave the village, will they still be able to raise wheat? He didn't expect Holo to answer in a way that would weaken her own position. But he was a merchant. He had dealt with any number of dishonest negotiators in his time. He had confidence that if Holo attempted to lie, he would know. Lawrence readied himself to catch the provocation he was sure would come. But come it didn't. When he looked at her, she wore an expression completely different from what he had seen so far. She looked angry and near tears as she stared into the corner of the wagon. What's wrong? Lawrence had asked. The village's abundant harvests will continue without me. I'm sorry. The village's abundant harvests will continue without me. She spat, her voice surprisingly irate. Is that so? Asked Lawrence, overwhelmed by the piercing anger that emanates from Holo. Holo nodded, squaring her shoulders. She gripped the furs tightly, her hands white from the effort. Long did I stay in that village, as many years as I have hairs on my tail. Eventually I wished to leave, but for the sake of the village's wheat I stayed. Long ago, you see, I made a promise with the youth of the village that I would ensure the village's harvest, so I kept my promise. Perhaps because she couldn't stomach it, she did not so much as look at Lawrence as she spoke. Earlier, her wit and words had been quick and easy. Now she stumbled unnecessarily. I am the wolf that lives in the wheat. My knowledge of wheat, of things that grow in the ground, is second to none. This is why I made the village's field so magnificent, as I promised. But to do that, occasionally the harvest must be poor. Forcing the land to produce requires compensation, but whenever the harvest was poor, the villagers attributed it to my capriciousness, and it has only gotten worse in recent years. I've been wanting to leave. I can stand it no longer. I long ago fulfilled my promise. Lawrence understood Holo's anger. Some years ago, Palstrow had come under the care of the Count Eldred, and since then, new farming techniques had improved. And since then, new farming techniques had been imported. And since then, new farming techniques had been imported from the south, increasing yield. He could not see her face to make for certain. Getting her words out all in one breath, Holo sighed deeply and fell over on the pile of furs yet again. She curled herself up, pulling the furs around her and burying her face in them. He could not see her face to make certain, but it seemed not. Hello, Trash Panda. Impossible that she was crying. Lawrence scratched his head, unsure of what to say. He looked helplessly at her slender shoulders and wolf ears. Perhaps this was how a real god acted. But now full of bluster and bravado, now wielding a sharp wit, now showing a childish temper. Lawrence was at a loss at how to treat the girl now. Nevertheless, he couldn't very well remain silent, so he took a new approach. In any case, setting aside the question of whether or not that's all true. "You think I'm a liar?" snapped Holo at his preamble. He faltered, but Holo seemed to realize that she herself was being too emotional. She stopped, abashed, and muttered a quick "sorry," before burying her head back into the furs again. "I understand your resentment, but where do you plan to go, having left the village?" She did not answer immediately, but Lawrence saw her ears prick at this question, so he waited patiently. She had just delivered a significant confession, and Lawrence expected that she simply couldn't face anyone for a moment. At length, Holo guiltily looked into the corner of the wagon, confirmed Lawrence's suspicions. "I wish to return home to my village. I wish to return to the north." "The north?" Holo nodded, turning her gaze up and off into the distance. Lawrence did not have to follow it to know where she was looking. True north. "My birthplace, the forest of Yotsu. So many years have passed that I can no longer count them. Wish to return home." The word birthplace left Lawrence momentarily shocked, and he looked at Holo's profile. He himself had not visited his hometown once since embarking on the life of a wandering merchant. It was a poor and cramped place of which he had few good memories, but after long days in the driver's seat, sometimes loneliness overcame him and he couldn't help think fondly of the place. If Holo was telling the truth, not only had she left her home hundreds of years ago, but she'd endured neglect and ridicule at the place that she had been settled. He could guess at her loneliness. "But I'd like to travel a bit. I've come all the way to this distant place after all, and surely much has changed over the months and years. So it would be good to broaden my perspective," said Holo, looking at Lawrence, her face a picture of calm. So long as you'll not take me back to palace or turn me into the church, I'd like to travel with you. You're a wandering merchant, are you not?" She regarded Lawrence with a friendly smile, but suggested she'd seen right through him and knew he would not betray her. She sounded like an old friend asking a simple favor. Lawrence had yet to determine whether or not he believed Holo's story, but as soon as he could tell, she was not a bad sort, and he'd begun to enjoy conversations with this strange girl. But he wasn't so won over by her charm as to forget his merchant's instincts. A good merchant had the audacity to face a god and the caution to doubt a close relative. Lawrence thought it over, and then spoke quietly. "I cannot make this decision quickly." He expected complaint, but had underestimated Holo the wise wolf. She nodded in comprehension. "It is good to be cautious, but I never misread a person. I don't believe you're so cold as to turn someone away." Holo spoke with a mischievous smile playing across her lips, but she then turned and hopped back into the pile of furs, albeit without the sulkiness shed down before. It seemed as though she was saying, "Enough talk for today." As Shed derailed off the conversation yet again, Lawrence could only grin in spite of himself as he watched Holo. He thought he could see her ears moving. Then her head popped out and she looked at him. "Surely you'll not tell me to sleep outside," she said, obviously aware that he could do no such thing. Lawrence shrugged. Holo giggled and returned to the fur pile. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Nevertheless, he doubted that her dissatisfaction with the village or her desire to return home were lies. And if those weren't lies, then he must believe that she was the real Holo. Because a mere demon-possessed girl would not be able to make it all up. Lawrence sighed as he realized that more thought would not yield any new answers. He decided to go to sleep and leave further ruminations for the morrow. Hello, Maple. The furs that Holo slept in belonged to Lawrence. It was ludicrous to think that their owner would forego their comfort and sleep on the wagon's driving bench. Telling her to move over to one side, he too snuggled into the fur pile. From behind him, he could hear the quiet sounds of Holo's breathing. Although he had told her he couldn't make a quick decision, Lawrence had already decided that as long as Holo had not made off with his goods in the morning, he would travel with her. From behind him, "Oh, Maple, thank you so much for the 100 biddies. Do not worry, we are not doing a particularly long stream, but I appreciate it. We're actually almost done." He doubted that she was that sort of troublemaker, but if she was, he thought she would surely make off with his entire load. He looked forward to the next day. After all, it had been a long time since he'd slept besides another. It was impossible to be unhappy with her slightly sweet scent piercing the strong-smelling furs. The horse heaved a sigh as if reading Lawrence's simple thought. Perhaps horses really could understand humans and simply preferred not to speak. Lawrence grinned ruefully and closed his eyes. And thus concludes the first chapter of the tale of Holo the Wise Wolf from Spice and Wolf. What do you guys think? Was that an enjoyable story time? I sure hope so. Oh, just Chained Chaos enjoyed it? Come on, guys. Please tell me you enjoyed it. Please. I would love to know who else out there enjoyed my reading. The rest are sleeping. As long as everybody is relaxing, that is what's important. I know this is a bit of a short stream, but this was a bit of a test, and I think I greatly underestimated exactly how exhausted such a reading for almost 2 hours straight would leave me. So I think we'll be concluding here for today. I have much more research to do and stuff to look into. Yomi, if you're there, I might poke you about some questions. But this was a nice time. I appreciate you all being here with me. For now, though, I think I must go rest. So thank you all so much for being here with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.